Hello, this is Dr. Shaw, and this is my presentation of the PhD dissertation and oral defense that I did at North Central University in Arizona. My PhD is in the area of psychology, and it's a concentration or emphasis in health psychology and behavioral medicine. So being a PhD program, this was a basic or theoretical study, not an applied study. I actually would have enjoyed it more had it been an applied study and done a PsyD instead of a PhD in psychology, but that given what it was, this is a theoretical study entitled Mindfulness Mechanisms and Stress Level During a Mind-Body Intervention, an 8-week correlational study of Taekwondo practitioners. So, in any oral defense, essentially you have to work through your research and what you completed from beginning to end, why you did it, some of the motivations. You'll notice in the agenda that the introduction generally is always first, some of the motivations for the study, conceptual framework, and the significance. How will this be either expanding theory in a theoretical study, or how would it be applying research in an applied study? The research questions and the hypotheses. So again, any good study is going to have to start with questions, and the questions themselves will delineate what kind of study this would be, whether quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods, and how that's going to work. Literature. So a literature review is perhaps one of the biggest pieces that make you an expert on your topic. Pretty much any question that's related to anything in your study, you're going to need to know what's the recent research on it. Methodology. So again, defining your questions, and then how do you seek out your own study. Findings, conclusions, practical implications, and limitations. And then the final section is always recommendations for future research. So it connects you through your literature review with researchers past. Now this is the current time, and then you're linking it with who's going to come along behind you and follow up with research after you've completed your study. So my motivation for the study, again, my area was psychology and health psychology and behavioral medicine. And many people who know me know that I practice Taekwondo, so it was something that kind of made my heart pound when you hear some different presentations on research that can be done. Essentially, you want to pick a topic that's something that you can stick with for a while, something that you're passionate about, at least in some way related. So as I refined my study down, I did want to use Taekwondo practitioners because I do it quite a bit. I teach a Taekwondo club and have done that for a number of years. As well, I was interested in mindfulness, and what does that mean? What are we talking about when someone says mindful? Is it deliberate? Is it something that we should avoid? Are we talking Buddhist practices? If you're a Christian, in some circles that would be seen as something that you would want to avoid. Some of the neuroscience literature actually says that mindfulness practices can have healthy or salutative effects on the brain. So I wanted to get my mind around what exactly are we talking about with mindfulness, as well as potential applications. There's a growing body of research demonstrating positive effects on stress, pain management, cognitive functioning, emotion regulation. So again, I wanted to dig into the other literature in my literature review on mindfulness to learn more about this phenomenon. And DBT would be dialectical behavior therapy. As a scientific construct, there's still questions about what mindfulness exactly is. What do we mean when we're talking about it? So you'll hear it a lot, that mindfulness, but a lot of people actually don't know what they're talking about or have a clear operational definition. So that was one of the purposes and motivations for me to dig into this study as well. The conceptual framework, so what theory specifically was I working with? In part, relational frame theory. Relational frame theory is actually a form of radical behaviorism. So it's a very pragmatic behavioral approach to understanding human behavior. And at its core, mindfulness is essentially a learned behavior. So it's based on language or a cluster of behaviors. One of the applications of relational frame theory is ACT, or acceptance and commitment therapy. And that's one where they will use mindfulness-based counseling techniques. If you hear acceptance and commitment therapy, that's actually based on relational frame theory. So that was an area that I wanted to expand in my study. They define mindfulness as a quality of consciousness and attention made up of different proposed mechanisms. Consciousness, awareness, and attention are fundamentally complex learned behaviors that are culturally constructed through direct observation. So the way that I would operationalize mindfulness is essentially it's attention, focus, awareness, and it's a learned behavior. So it's nothing Buddhist necessarily or spiritual. It's actually a learned behavior. And stress level as well, or stress perception, is likewise a learned response. So I've had students that will say, I'm stressed out, or what is stress? Essentially, stress as well, or the perception of it, is a learned behavior. So again, going back to relational frame theory, much of it comes down to the language that we use in describing phenomenon. So the problem and the significant. The extant literature on mind-body interventions employing mindfulness has not clearly delineated the salutary or the health-promoting effects of exercise and the possible salutary effects of mindfulness. So there's a bit of a confound there, or a confounding variable, when we look at different research. It's been shown that physically active people demonstrate greater mindfulness and less stress. So do I need to practice a mindfulness-based practice, or can I just go for a run, or go to Taekwondo class, or go for a swim? Would that have the same benefit, or would it help to actually talk to a counselor and learn some mindfulness strategies? Well, that's the million-dollar question, and the research really hadn't teased that out before. That these two mechanisms are intertwined in mind-body interventions constitutes a possible confound, because beneficial outcomes attributed to mindfulness may actually be due just to physical activity or an active lifestyle. So in some ways we want to tease out and say, how is one thing related to the other, or are they related at all? My questions. Question number 1, what is the relationship, if any, between mindfulness training and stress levels among Taekwondo practitioners? So if we're talking relationship, we're likely talking about correlation. Again, correlation does not equal causation, but we want to define what's the relationship itself. Question 2, what effect does the application of mindfulness training have on mindfulness mechanisms among Taekwondo practitioners? So again, what's the effect? What is the relationship, if any, between the different 5 mindfulness mechanisms and stress level among Taekwondo practitioners? And question number 4, what effect, if any, will mindfulness training have on the relationship between the 5 different mindfulness mechanisms and stress level among Taekwondo practitioners? So those were the 4 questions that were essentially my study that I sought to answer. So each hypothesis, because this is a quantitative study, has a hypothesis and a null hypothesis. So my hypothesis number 1, over time, mindfulness training reduces stress levels among Taekwondo practitioners. That's my hypothesis, and I am trying to support that. Again, in research, we don't prove anything, but we demonstrate support for. The null hypothesis, number 1, there's no relationship between mindfulness training and stress levels among Taekwondo practitioners. Hypothesis number 2, the application of mindfulness training will show measurable changes in mindfulness mechanisms among Taekwondo practitioners. The null, the application will have no effect. So basically the null hypothesis is just the opposite, that this really has no effect whatsoever. Number 3, there's a relationship between mindfulness mechanisms and stress level among Taekwondo practitioners. And the null hypothesis, there's no relationship between mindfulness mechanisms and stress level among Taekwondo practitioners. And then the final 4th hypothesis, mindfulness training will have an effect on the relationship between mindfulness mechanisms and stress level among Taekwondo practitioners. And the null is we're saying, nope, it's not going to happen. So anytime we're doing a quantitative study, we have our variables that we're looking at and looking at our hypotheses that either will have support for or they will not have support, and then that validates the null hypothesis. So one or the other will be true. Either the hypothesis is true, or if it is not true, then the null hypothesis has support. So my literature review, and what I often talk in class when I teach, is that there's a funneling approach. So we're starting very high and broad in terms of complementary and alternative medicine. So that really ties in everything from chiropractic to vitamins to prayer, stress management approaches like Jon Kabat-Zinn, mindfulness-based stress reduction, acceptance and commitment therapy, martial arts, physical exercise, running, yoga, swimming, you name it. So very broadly, what does the literature say about complementary and alternative medicine? Then a little bit on the science, from stress reaction to mind-body stress management. Relational frame theory and acceptance and commitment therapy. So again, I mentioned a couple slides back that relational frame theory is the theoretical construct, and ACT is the applied counseling theory that, or a series of techniques that is based on relational frame theory. Mindfulness, so what does the research say as the cutting-edge research on mindfulness? What is it? What does it look like? How do people define it? Can we start to generate some operational definitions around what we're talking about? Mind-body stress reduction, so that's a specific program that was developed by Dr. Jon Kabat-Zinn. So specifically, what is that? Because it is a specific mind-body stress reduction program that would have some elements of mindfulness embedded within it. Also looking at the research on the interaction of stress and exercise. So what does the research say about people who are physically fit or active? Do they report a different perception of stress because of their physically active lifestyle? Those are the types of questions I wanted to look at. How about the literature on martial arts in general? So again, because I'm doing a PhD in behavioral medicine, health psychology, I'm looking at specific studies that are from medicine, from psychology, from sociology, studies that are in any way, shape, or form health related to martial arts. And then again, going from broad to very specific. Martial arts is too broad. Now I need to narrow it down to Taekwondo in particular. So that's really my funneling approach, where I go from very broad to very specific. So what does the research say about Taekwondo in particular? And of course, when you get to this level of precision for a PhD study, probably nothing at this point has been written on my particular topic. And that's actually what you want for a PhD level, doctoral level research. So the methodology, and this would be the chapter 3 of a study. It's quasi-experimental, so it's not a pure experiment because there's things that I could not control, which is often the case when you're working with human subjects. At this point, because I am working with people, I have participants that voluntarily have to give consent to be a part of the program, even among different schools, and generally I'm not going to use only my school or my school in general, because that would be it would be questionable ethically. So it's a quasi-experimental design. It's quantitative, so using statistics, non-equivalent groups design. The treatment group and the control group, so I had two groups that I was comparing, were offered the FFMQ, that's the 5-factor mindfulness questionnaire. It was basically a survey that used a questionnaire format that I was able to then operationalize mindfulness through the 5 factors. It's actually beneficial to use a tool that's been validated, it's reliable, and then you can pull from other research to say this is a valid instrument that I want to use, versus trying to develop your own tool, which then you have to validate and essentially verify that it's reliable and is testing what you want it to. And then also the PSS, or the Perceived Stress Scale by Cohen. And that's also a validated, reliable stress perception scale. So I used it at the beginning of the study, so there's in essence a pre-test, and then again at 8 weeks. So that was my post-test. Participants were assigned to either the treatment group or control group based on gender, age cohort, and years of martial arts. So it was not a random assignment. I wanted to make sure that in both groups that there was a representative sample of both males and females. I wanted to make sure there was a representative sample in both groups of those who were beginners in martial arts, as well as seasoned martial artists, color belts, black belts, in both groups. What I didn't want to happen was have one group be mostly black belts and adults, where I had maybe college students, still adults, but maybe 18, 19-year-olds in one group who are just starting out. So I wanted to make sure there was representative participants in both groups. Only the treatment group was offered and participated in the mindfulness training, or the actual intervention, during week 4 of the study. So again, this was an 8-week study, and right at the midway point. Now again, because I'm the researcher, I can't be the one giving the intervention. So that was done by Dr. Jan Shrigardis, who was the actual trainer that provided a mindfulness training. So essentially, even though I developed the curriculum for it, it was taken from my literature review, my chapter 2, to say these are best practices, here's an understanding of mindfulness training, including some of the research on health and physical fitness and mindfulness studies that have looked at different physically active people. So again, we're not making any claims about Taekwondo in particular, or even necessarily martial arts, but just saying here's mindfulness and some of the research on it and what this looks like compared with exercise and some of the things we know. So again, that was only offered to the treatment group. So how did we operationalize it? Again, the 5-factor mindfulness questionnaire identified the following proposed mechanisms of mindfulness. So these are the 5 factors: observing, describing, acting with awareness, non-judgment, and non-reactivity. So there were 39 questions, so it's not exhaustive of the FFMQ. They were on a 5-point Likert type scale with ranges from 1, so this is never true or rarely, to a 5, very often or always true. The test was designed for the average reader to be able to complete it in less than 15 minutes. So the average time for most participants was somewhere around 8 to 11 minutes, 10 minutes roughly. So most, I don't know of anyone that took actually 15 minutes to do it. Most did it quite quickly. And then the other form was the perceived stress scale. It was a 5-minute self-report measure that quantified stress levels. So again, this is perception. And people could answer it however they wanted. There were 5 possible responses, also a Likert type scale, 0 to 4, never, all the way up to very often. So this gave me some numbers and some data to work with when we had finished in being able to compare the 2 groups. So what did we find? Hypothesis number 1, there was evidence of a real decline in stress from pre-test to post-test. That was good. So actually the mindfulness training did have an effect on my post-test group among the treatment group, so that was exciting. Hypothesis 2, for 3 of the 5 subscales, there was actually no evidence of a differential change. There were significant findings that were found, but they were contrary to expectations. So sometimes that happens. You have a hypothesis or what you think will happen, and sometimes nothing happens, and sometimes the opposite happens. There's actually an inverse relationship. On the non-judgment mechanism of mindfulness, the treatment group showed evidence of a significant decrease in this component of mindfulness. With regard to the observing facet of mindfulness, change was restricted to participants with the least experience in martial arts, so that was interesting as well. Contrary to expectation, the treatment group showed a significant decline in observing, and not really sure why. That could be something to look at in future research, perhaps. Hypothesis number 3. 4 of the 5 correlations between stress level and the various mindfulness mechanisms were statistically significant. All 4 could be categorized or characterized as moderate strength, but most were counterintuitively positively signed. Individuals who reported greater stress were the same individuals who reported higher scores on the observe, awareness, and non-judgmental subscales of the FFMQ. So that was interesting, that maybe people who perceive stress at a higher level are also those who are more observant or more aware of their perceptions. On the other hand, the direction of the relationship between stress and the non-reactionary subscale of the FFMQ was negative, and that would be expected. The 5th correlation involving the described component of mindfulness and stress was not statistically significant. So that piece of it really didn't give us anything useful to work with. Hypothesis number 4, the effect of mindfulness training on reductions in stress level was inconsistent and uncertain. So the data support the inference that the treatment group did experience a reduction in stress, going back to hypothesis number 1, but the data, however, didn't support the inference that the explanation for that reduction was the mindfulness training that the treatment group received. So again, we can't really conclude that this was why. Sometimes you have extraneous variables that may have affected the study one way or another. We really weren't able to make sense of it. So practical implications and limitations. And again, the sign of a good study or research is that we want to be forthright, we want to be accountable, we want to have a peer review process where we're sharing our data. It's out there, it's published on the web. So the full study is available on ProQuest. For those that are taking it in class, I also have my dissertation that I've posted in Blackboard or in the course learning page. So practical implications and limitations. We can say mindfulness training reduces stress among Taekwondo practitioners or the physically active. So that was something that we could say yes. A challenge, the goal was 128 participants, so there was enough power. We had a good sample size. However, the initial participation was actually limited to 51. There were 51 participants. We had academies. 4 academies had agreed to participate. There were 2 in the Lansing area. There was 1 in the Greenville-Belmont area of Michigan, and 1 in Grand Rapids, my instructor's academy, as well as some students that had cross-trained both through my academy, or my program at the college, and my instructor's academy. So following attrition, there were 38 participants that actually completed. So 51 was still a pretty good number to start out with. That gave us a good sample size. And there were 13 participants in the treatment group. So some of the concerns or limitations perhaps were that the study was completed over the holiday season. Sometimes you can't always control when your study is going to be. You need to get done. You're at a point in the semester or at a point in your academic career where I just want to graduate. I want to get this thing done. If I could plan it at a time when is really good for college students, well, it wouldn't be during exam time. It wouldn't be over the holidays. It wouldn't be during midterms. It wouldn't be over spring break. It wouldn't be over fall break. And, well, wait a minute, everybody's gone for summer. So sometimes you just have to work with what you work with. So the holiday season might have been a factor in some of the attrition and participation being less than what I wanted. Michigan weather was a concern, so because I was doing it in the spring semester, January, February, March, there were some times where some, especially in the outlying areas, driving to Lansing, some people, because of blizzards or snowstorms, who had agreed to participate in the study, actually were not going to Taekwondo as often because the weather was bad. The roads were dangerous, so that limited my study. Hawthorne effect and group contact, because again, I was an external researcher that was coming in to work with the academies. Some agreed to participate, but I was actually there. May have pulled out or said, yeah, I'm not sure I want to do this. That was the case in one academy where several people had signed up, and then when one person said, yeah, I'm not sure I want to do this anymore, I don't want to be a part of the study, then a couple other people said, yeah, then I don't either. And that's kind of, it is what it is. Limited mindfulness training. So again, in a perfect world, you would have several weeks of mindfulness training. There might be some experiential exercises. The intervention itself that Dr. Jan Shrigardis presented the participants with in the treatment group only received a 3-hour training. So it was not a significant time. Perhaps with more training or a more substantial training, it might have affected the outcomes. And that's a legitimate limitation, and yet that's what I had to work with. Again, when you're working with human subjects, all of this has to be approved by a human subjects review board, and they felt that the limited 3-hour mindfulness training was appropriate, that it was not putting any participants at a high level of risk or potential for harm. The benefits of the study outweighed the risks, so it was approved as is, so that's what I went with. So recommendation. What would I do in the future if I had more time, more money, more participants, more schools, things like that? Well, I'd have more of a robust population sampling. So if 51, 52 people is great and I end up with 27 or 30, It would even be a better study if I had over 100, if I had 200, if I had 500, if I had 1,000. That would just add greater statistical power and generalizability. So the more the merrier. Anytime you're working with numbers in a quantitative study, the larger your sample, the better. The smaller your sample gets, especially if it gets dangerously small, that could put your study at risk of having an insufficient sample size. So more people is better. Additional geographic areas beyond West Michigan. So because I live in West Michigan, my schools that I was looking at were in Grand Rapids, Greenville, Belmont, in Lansing, or the Lansing area. That's what I had to work with. But if I had more time, more gas money, more availability to invest in the study, I'd do the whole state of Michigan, or I could say I'd like to do the study regionally: Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Wisconsin, Illinois. But didn't do that. A mixed method study would be helpful. So not only having the quantitative on one side, but maybe adding qualitative on the other, and doing some structured interviews and trying to follow up and better understand some of the numbers and the data that I got from the quantitative portion. Maybe looking at other studies on mindful modes of exercise beyond Taekwondo. So again, I delimited my study specifically to Taekwondo. Could there or would there be differences with karate or tai chi or kung fu or other martial arts? We don't know. So again, because I only looked at Taekwondo, that's how my study was limited. As well, additional mindfulness training, so ongoing effects over time. Not only one training, but a longer training, multiple trainings over the entire period of an 8-week or 6-week or 16-week or 6-month study. The more time, the better. Do a longitudinal study. That could be valuable also. So essentially, that's the major takeaways. When I get at the end of any study or oral defense, you conclude by generally thanking your professors, those that have had an impact on your work, because again, I was working with Taekwondo practitioners, thanking the instructors, the school owners, the students, that without them, without my participants who willingly participated in my study, I couldn't have done the study. So always a shout out to the participants in your study. And again, ending with that sense that this is not the final word. There's more to be done. This is just one small chapter in an ongoing narrative of the research on your topic. So it serves as a further discussion in an ongoing dialogue. So that is the study. Certainly, I can get anyone a copy of the full dissertation if you're interested in reading it. For those in my research stats class, it's usually uploaded into the learning management system, and you can always email me for that as well, or just go on to ProQuest. And it is published. It's available online. It's pretty easy to find. So thank you so much, and have a great rest of the day.